Hello everybody, welcome to another map of the day. So the map that we're going to be looking at today is called Mount Kailash. So the special thing about this map is that technologies that are normally supposed to be researched at the monastery are not going to be available at the monastery. Instead, they must be researched at this temple, which is on top of the mountain. Aside from that, the temple can also create relics, which cost nothing but time. Now, moving technologies from one building to another is something that we were already capable of doing just with RMS effects. But what's going to be interesting about this is that we're going to have a full monastery tech tree for every player, regardless of what civ they happen to be. So if you noticed, I'm playing as Persians, which have notoriously bad monks, and you can see that all of the Castle Age techs are available when I am in control of this monument here. And then the other special thing is that we only want to enable the given techs when the appropriate age has been researched. So see, we're in the Castle Age here, and only the Castle Age techs are enabled. And if we try to go up to the Imperial Age, now all of the Imperial Age techs are enabled as well. So putting that extra bit of complexity in is going to require an excess script, and we will get to that later. So to start us off, I have reverted the map back to an earlier state where we can see that the monastery technologies are still available at the monastery. They have not been moved to the monument yet, and we can see that the tech tree for the monastery specifically is still whatever it is normal for Persians. So they don't get, for example, sanctity, redemption, atonement, heresy, that kind of thing. To take a look at the map's code, we start off with having some RMS effects. So over here, this is just decoration upgrading some trees. And then this chunk of code over here is what's enabling us to create relics from the monument when we control it. Now, normally it's not possible to create Gaia units from player buildings. In this case, we had to use a little bit of a workaround. So a relic cart 1304 is a special object in the sense that its dead unit is a relic itself. So since a relic cart is a player controllable unit, that is what we are enabling to be created from the monument. And we just use some other effects to change its name. And then when we set its hit points to 0, as soon as the relic card is created, it's going to die and then instantly spawn a relic because the relic happens to be its dead unit. So that's just an interesting workaround. And if we keep looking down the script, we can see that this chunk of code here is commented out, and this is what's setting the location of the monastery text to the monument instead of the monastery. We're going to leave this commented out for now because it's going to be easier to debug our access script when everything is at the monastery, but we will enable this later because that's kind of the purpose of the map. So this next chunk of code is disabling all of the monastery texts, and this is something we're actually going to implement in our map here, because when we do this, when we start off with everybody having the technologies disabled, it makes it easier to enable them in the excess, since we don't need to worry about which civs need which technologies. If everything is disabled, we can just say that every civ is going to need every technology, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. So with that out of the way, I think we can start including the excess script that we are going to need. So right now the excess script is blank, and what we're going to put in here is a rule that constantly checks whether a particular player has reached the Castle Age to enable the Castle Age text, and then keep checking to see when they reach the Imperial Age to enable the Imperial Age text. So what we're going to need here is a rule. And this rule is going to be active from the start. It's going to be a high frequency rule also, which means it's going to check as often as it can. So every time we run this rule, what I want to have happen is I want to loop through all of the players and check their current age status. And if they happen to be in the castle age, then we can enable the castle age text. And that's what we're going to do first, is that we're going to loop through the players. So we're going to start out with a for loop. So player ID is something that we don't have to declare externally. It is implicitly defined when we implement this for loop, equals 1, and then a semicolon, less than or equal to total players. Now, total players is something that we have to declare. So we will declare that up at the top as a type integer, total players equals 0. And then to set the value of total players to the correct number of players which are in the game, in our case 6, we can use the XS function, XS get num players. So when we say total players is equal to get num players, it should set that equal to 6. And then when we implement our for loop, we can say that for player ID equals 1, to player ID equals 6, and then we can continue with this loop. And then for each of these players, I want to check their current age. So I want to put this conditional in if XS player attribute of player ID, which is the player that we are looping through. And then I want to check current age. So if I go into the constants, I can see there's an attribute current age, which is equal to 6. So I can say the player's current age is greater than or equal to the castle age. And if I go into constants, similar to how all these attributes have a numerical equivalent, we can see that the particular ages have a numerical equivalent also. So if I say the dark age, that is equivalent to 0, feudal age is 1, castle age is 2. So if I say that if the player's current age is greater than or equal to castle age, then we can start to enable monastery texts. And we will do that with XS effect amount. And we will say the effect we need is C enable tech. We need the unit or technology ID. So if we want to enable sanctity, for example, we go into text. Sanctity is 231. We will say C attribute enable. The value in this case is the tech ID, which is 231. And the particular player number is going to be equal to player ID, which is the player that we're looping through. So this should enable sanctity. And in a similar way to enabling sanctity, we can enable all the other castle age texts when that particular player has reached the castle age. Now, simply for debugging purposes, up towards the top here, I'm going to say XS chat data. It's going to be player 1 age, so the age that player 1 happens to be in. We're just basically going to chat the value of player 1's age. So let's test this and see what we have for us. So we can see that we are constantly chatting the value of 1 because player 1 is in the feudal age. And if we reference that back to the constants file, that is correct. We are in the feudal age, so it should still always be returning 1. And if we get ourselves up to the castle age, we can see that it's now returning a 2 when we are chatting the current age. And we can see that all the castle age monastery texts have been researched. Now that all seems nice, but this comes with kind of a caveat, because let's say I want to research sanctity. That's very nice, but then it just enabled sanctity again. So basically what we have in our current situation, we have no way to check whether the texts have already been enabled to prevent us from enabling them a second time, in our case, after they've already been researched. So we're going to need some way to check to make sure that we have enabled these texts already, so we don't enable them more than once. And the way that we're going to do that is by using an array. So an array is basically just an index variable. So if it helps to give some visual representation. So player 1 can have a value for this array. Player 2 can have a value, player 3, and similarly for all the players in the game. While player 1 can have a value of 1, player 2 can be 0. So basically, the value of the variable for each player is independent of the other players. And that's basically what the array is supposed to be doing. So when using arrays in XS, there are a couple things to know about. So first of all is the syntax for creating the array. We'll get rid of this chat data. So if we want to create an array, we have to know what type of array we want to create. So if I say XS array create integer, that will create an array of type integer. So each of the indices of this array will be of type integer. We could also make them type float, type boolean, type string. You get the idea. But in this case, we're going to create an array of integers. So the size of this array is basically how many indices we're going to need. So if we want one index for every player, then the size is going to be equal to total players. And so the default value is whatever the default value of each index is going to be set to. So in our case, we're going to set it to 0, and then once the player has reached the castle age, we will set that to a 1 for that particular player. So default value is 0, and third argument is a unique name, so we'll call it castle age check. So that's how we create arrays. Now, in order to reference or set an array, it's important to know that arrays are not referenced by their string name. They are referenced by their numerical ID, which happens to be an integer. So up at the top here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable of type integer and call it array underscore C to represent the castle age array. And then over here, we're going to say, we're going to set that variable to the numerical ID of this array. And then this variable is what we're going to use to reference this array anytime we need it. So in order to set the value of an array, which in this case we will do over here, you can say XS array set integer, and then the array ID is the numerical ID, which we have already declared as array C. And then the particular index of the array is which index we're going to be modifying. So if player 1 happened to reach the castle age, we want to set player 1, the index for player 1. And if player 5 reached the castle age, we want to set the index for player 5. Now, it's important to note that array indices start counting from 0 instead of 1. So if this is the value, the index starts counting from 0. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So player 1 actually has the index of 0. So if we happen to be looping through this for loop and we happen to have our player ID set to 1, we do not want to check index 1, we want to check index 0. So in this case, it will be player ID minus 1. And then we will set that value to 1. So if player 1 happened to reach the castle age, then we set index 0 to the value of 1. And then to make sure that we are not enabling these texts more than once, we'll put an extra set of conditionals on this if statement. We'll say double ampersand means and then we will reference the value of the array by saying XS array get integer. The array ID is going to be array C. And then the index, again, is going to be player ID minus 1. And you want to check that against the value of 0. So if the value of the particular array index is equal to 0, then we enable the text. But then immediately after doing that, we set that array index to 1 so that the next time we loop through, we won't enable those texts again. So we'll make sure our parentheses are balanced over here. And we'll add this semicolon over here. And then I think we should be good to test. So as we can see in the feudal age, no monastery texts are available. And if we get ourselves up to the castle age, it seems we've taken a bit of a step backwards because we still have no monastery texts available. So we have something going wrong in our XS script, and I'll try to explain what's going on here. So basically it has to do with the fact that when we create this array, we are creating it every single time that we run this rule. So if we run the rule the first time, it'll create this array. But as soon as we run it again, it'll basically erase the array that we created the first time. So it's important to only create the array one time. And the way we're going to do that is with another variable called init. It's going to be equal to 0 at first. And then up at the top here, we'll say if init is equal to 0, then there's a set of code that we're only going to execute once, because at the end of this we will say init is equal to 1. So if we add this particular step, well, first of all, we'll only set the total players in the game once, and we only really need to set it once. But also, the array that we're going to create to check whether we're in castle age or not is only going to be initialized once. And this should help us with our issue that we're experiencing. So again, no monastery text in the feudal age. And now, since we are only creating that array once, we now see that we have the Castle Age text here. And importantly, they are only enabled one time. We see we researched all these, and they don't get enabled again, even though this rule is still constantly running in the background. So now that we have our rule in this position where it's successfully detecting when we're in the Castle Age, we can do a very similar thing for the Imperial Age also. So we will create another array, which is going to be array underscore I for Imperial Age. We will create the array, we'll initialize it over here the first time we execute this rule, and we'll call it Imperial Age check. And then similarly for checking if we are in the Castle Age, we will also check C Imperial Age, and then instead of comparing it to the Castle Age array, we will compare it to the Imperial Age array over here and over here. And then instead of enabling the Castle Age monastery text, we will instead enable the Imperial Age monastery text, which is faith, block printing, illumination, and theocracy. So besides that, the only other thing I want to add is some sort of conditional as to when we can disable this rule. Basically, after all the players in the game have reached the Imperial Age, then we no longer need to keep constantly checking, because all of the text at that point should be enabled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up another variable type integer, and we'll say total players which are in Imperial. So as soon as a player reaches the Imperial Age, we will increment this variable by 1 by using ++. And then outside of this, well, I guess it can be outside of this for loop. So if, and we'll check the criteria, the total players who are in Imperial Age is equal to the total players in the game, that would signify that everybody is in the Imperial Age. Then we can use the XS function, which is XS disable self. And then at that point we can stop checking, and then just to indicate that that's working, I will just put a chat statement in here that says XS chat data, which says all players are in Imperial Age. So that'll just be to indicate whether this rule was successfully able to be disabled. So we already saw that all of our Castle Age texts are available and only researched once. And now when we are in the Imperial Age, we can see that our Imperial Age texts are the same. And then since everybody is in the Imperial Age, we can see that this little chat statement here says all players are Imperial Age, which indicates that we were successfully able to disable the rule, and we no longer need to keep checking. Now, one thing I'm just noticing is that we didn't specify a name for our rule here. Now, in this case, it's not very critical since we're not trying to reference this rule from anything, since it's the only rule present in our script. But usually it's proper to give it a name, so I'll just give it a name, enable text, so that if there was ever anything else, any other rules or functions that needed to reference this particular rule, we could use that name to reference it. But it works either way. So back in our RMS script, we can now that we have completed our excess portion, we can now move the monastery text to the monument instead of where they normally are at the monastery. And then this monastery building was just for debugging purposes, so we can get rid of that as well. So now we can see that the texts are now available at the monument instead of the monastery, and it works just the same as it did last time we checked. So it looks like that portion of our map is working rather nicely. So one more thing, one last little piece that I want to consider is what would happen if we started the game in the Imperial Age. So if we start the game in the Imperial Age, that implies that all the Castle Age technologies should already be researched at no cost. So let's try and start the game in the Imperial Age and see if what we have now is going to reflect that behavior. So we'll start the game in the Imperial Age, and then we can see that in contrast to what we would consider normal, the Castle Age texts have not been researched. In fact, we can see that they are still able to be researched at their normal cost. So the last little piece that we're going to put into this map is we're going to consider what happens when we start the game in the Imperial Age and subsequently the post-Imperial Age. So basically what this last chunk of code is doing is that if we start in the Imperial Age, then we are going to make all of the Castle Age monastery texts free and instant, so that when the XS enables them, they are finished immediately. And then if the game starts in the post-Imperial Age, we will do that for both Castle and Imperial Age texts. So if we want to make the Castle Age texts researched as soon as the game starts, we just set their costs and all their times to 0. And then when we include this little bit, that should help us out. So now we have captured the monument, and we can see the key difference is that the Castle Age texts are no longer available. And to check whether they have indeed come into effect, we will create a monk. We can see that the monk has 45 hit points, indicating that Sanctity was able to be researched. So now our map behaves as it would normally work in a standard game, where when we start in the Imperial Age, all of the Castle Age texts have already been researched at no cost. And that basically wraps up this example of how to use XS to implement some creative effects into a map. So hopefully you guys have learned something with this video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.